Thanks for checking out Evolving the Web. I'm Bob Michaels, and today's episode is sponsored by Content Access. I'm going to give you all the background and the lowdown on web accessibility today, where it came from, how it's evolved, and how it's become a major part of all websites. So let's start at the beginning. In 1999, the World Wide Web Consortium, or the W3C, which is an international organization that develops web standards, they introduced the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or what we call WCAG, under its Web Accessibility Initiative. These guidelines provided a structured approach to making digital content accessible for folks with disabilities. Over time, WCAG has evolved to address new challenges and emerging technologies. So here's the evolution. WCAG 1.0 was released in 1999. It focused on basic HTML accessibility, primarily helping blind and low vision users by improving screen reader compatibility. In 2008, WCAG 2.0 introduced the Perceivable, Operable, Understandable, and Robust, or POUR framework, broadening accessibility beyond vision impairments to include cognitive, auditory, and mobility disabilities. A decade later, in 2018, WCAG 2.1 built on that framework, improving accessibility for users with ADHD, low vision, and mobile devices. In 2023, WCAG 2.2 added even more success criteria focused on cognitive disabilities and mobile usability. The key thing to remember is that WCAG is technology neutral. It applies not just to websites, but also to mobile apps, digital platforms, and emerging tech. That sets it apart from legally mandated government standards, which came from a different place altogether. The U.S. government had its own accessibility rules, most notably Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. Before 2017, WCAG and Section 508 were separate, which created lots of legal confusion for institutions and businesses, as you can imagine. Section 508 was first enacted in 1973 and later amended in 1998, requiring federal agencies and contractors to make their electronic and information tech accessible. But it had some big limitations. First, it was very technology specific, meaning it focused on rigid HTML and software design rules instead of WCAG's flexible principle-based approach. Second, it only applied to federal agencies. Private companies, state governments, universities, and public school systems weren't required to comply unless they'd received federal funds or had federal contracts. Finally, it was narrow in scope, originally covering just HTML-based websites while ignoring mobile apps and dynamic content. Well, that left a huge gap in accessibility adoption and enforcement back then. So universities, private companies, and state governments weren't required to follow either Section 508 or WCAG. Some followed Section 508 if they had federal funding, while others adopted WCAG as a best practice. For years, higher education institutions were in a legal gray area without a clear law requiring WCAG compliance. Plaintiffs had to argue that inaccessible websites and digital content violated broader civil rights protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. So, recognizing that Section 508 was outdated, the U.S. Access Board updated it in 2017 to adopt the WCAG 2.0 level AA as the new standard. And this was a big deal. It meant that for the first time, federal accessibility rules were aligned with WCAG. So the 2017 update required federal agencies and contractors to follow WCAG 2.0 AA, replacing the old technology-specific Section 508 rules. It also expanded coverage to include mobile apps, PDFs, and other digital content. One of the biggest shifts was in procurement. Federal agencies could now only purchase WCAG-compliant digital services and platforms. So while this was a major step forward, it still didn't fully close the gap. State universities, private colleges, and non-federal entities weren't legally required to follow WCAG, leaving accessibility largely voluntary outside of the federal space. So without clear legal mandates, compliance varied widely, and that led to lawsuits. So before the DOJ issued its 2024 rule under Title II, WCAG compliance was a frequent courtroom debate. Without a direct legal mandate, lawsuits depended on how judges interpreted the existing law. So plaintiffs in private sector cases often sued under Title III of the ADA, which covers places of public accommodation. They argued that websites and digital platforms fell under this category, but the courts weren't consistent. Some ruled in favor of WCAG-based claims, while others threw cases out due to the lack of formal web accessibility law. Higher ed institutions like Harvard and MIT were sued under Title III, even though WCAG wasn't explicitly required. Businesses were also targeted, with the most famous case being the Domino's Pizza lawsuit, where courts ultimately ruled that the company's website and mobile app had to be accessible under the ADA. Public institutions, on the other hand, were sued under Title II of the ADA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. These lawsuits argued that inaccessible websites denied students with disabilities equal access to education. The Office for Civil Rights, or OCR, started tackling web accessibility complaints in the early 2000s, ensuring that educational institutions' digital content met federal disability laws. Over time, OCR's enforcement strategy shifted with different presidential administrations. Some periods saw more aggressive enforcement and proactive compliance reviews, while others took a more hands-off approach. But regardless, OCR has remained involved in digital accessibility, enforcing how educational institutions navigate and achieve compliance. So before 2024, website accessibility cases relied more on legal arguments than on concrete, federally mandated standard. Some lawsuits succeeded, but others failed because there was no clear federal enforcement mechanism. That all changed with the DOJ's 2024 rule under Title II. Now, for the first time, WCAG 2.1 AA is a legally enforceable requirement for all public institutions. This ruling lays the groundwork for future lawsuits against private businesses under Title III, with WCAG 2.1 AA now written into law for public entities. Businesses, in addition to federal agencies, state government agencies, higher education institutions, and public school districts, need to act now to avoid lots of potential legal headaches and expense down the road. And it's just the right thing to do, right? Don't limit access to your information. So make sure you're WCAG aware and taking care of your disabled site visitors and users. I hope that sheds some light on web accessibility, where it came from, and how it's evolved over time. Thanks for checking out this edition of Evolving the Web. I'm Bob Michaels, and I'll see you next time.